Okay, good evening, everybody. For those of us who happen not to have met me before, my name is Nicholas Saul, and I'm here in my capacity as Director of the Institute of Advanced Study of the University of Durham, responsible for the Arts and Humanities faculty. And I'm very proud to introduce David Willetts, David Baron Willetts of Havant, who is going to lecture us this evening, as a co-production, I may say, with my colleague, Professor David Held, Master of University College. I'll just say a few words to introduce David Willetts, and then we will move on. David Willetts, Baron Willetts of Havant, was Conservative Minister of State for Universities and Science in the coalition government of 2010 to 2014, having formerly served as an advisor in the Treasury and also in Margaret Thatcher's policy unit. He famously presided over the introduction of student fees set at the level of £9,000 and the removal of the enrolment cap. As an eloquent and scholarly, Oxford-educated critic of Oxbridge privilege and promoter of university pluralism, notably in teaching quality and curriculum breadth, and an unrepentant advocate of the need for market-driven, continuous change of the university in today's global context, David Willetts remains to this day a figure of controversy. Yet he is also a fierce critic of unintended Brexit consequences, of the Home Office immigration policy on foreign students. He's also an opponent of the grammar school, a strong apologist of the British University's tradition of international research excellence, and a staunch defender of university autonomy. Unusually for many practicing politicians, David Willetts holds academic posts, notably in London and Oxford, of course. He once, in this context, confessed that his fellow Tory MPs considered him, and I'm quoting here, David, a dangerous intellectual, unquote, who was, and I'm quoting again, out of touch with reality due to his interest in ideas, unquote. He's currently Executive Chair of the Resolution Foundation. In the footsteps of Wilhelm von Humboldt, John Henry Newman, and David Lodge, another David, David Willetts has just established and published his personal memoir and vision of the future, A University Education, published by Oxford University Press, 2017. And I'm reliably informed by the author that copies are available at the back of the hall at the end of the lecture. David is going to talk for perhaps 50 minutes or so, and we should then have a good time for questions from the audience afterwards. And so now, without further ado, we welcome David Willetts today to share his thoughts with us on the future of the university, a university education.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. It's great to be here. I have visited this leading university on a range of occasions over the past few years, but this is a particular privilege to be invited here to give this lecture. And speaking in this historic building, whose historic significance in the emergence of the University of Durham, I now understand rather better after having a very enjoyable education over dinner. I should start with a historical context for our understanding of the university. So, first there was Oxford and Cambridge. Around in the 12th century, 13th century, across Europe, a very small number of universities were created, probably originally created around the intellectual excitement that was generated by the translation back into Latin of ancient classical texts which had been preserved in the Muslim Empire and Byzantium. So you have Bologna, you have the Sorbonne, you have Oxford, created in the 12th century. And in 1209, a group of academics at Oxford, unhappy with the situation at Oxford, leave Oxford and create Cambridge. So by the early 13th century, Europe had got about a dozen universities, 2 of which were in England, Oxford and Cambridge. And my next slide, oops, hang on, we've jumped several. My next slide, here we are. Oh, sorry, now I'm going to, sorry, this is jumping very quickly. Let's see. Good. Right. This slide tells you a lot about the shape of English higher education to this day. This slide tells you that by 1300, England had got 2 universities, and there were similar numbers in Italy, France, Spain. For the next, all through European history, through the late medieval period, through the Renaissance, the Reformation, across the continent, they kept on creating universities. So the leading cities of Europe certainly had a university by the time of Napoleon, and probably had a university by the time of the Reformation. They kept on creating universities, which meant that you had, for where the population was living, you had a local university. But look at England. England had 2 universities by 1209, and for the next 600 years, it carried on having only 2 universities. And that was because Oxford and Cambridge ruthlessly organized and used their links to political power in London to suppress the creation of other universities. It's a classic case study in the power of a duopoly. They were keeping out the competition. Now, this has a very important implication. It means that if you want to go to university, you have to go away from home to go to university. You don't have a local university. So across the continent, you have a model of the local university serving all the population centres. In England, you have the model that you go away to home, you leave home in order to go to a university elsewhere, which is residential, because that is the only way that you get to study. So if you want to understand why on the M6 or the M1 today, in late September, you will have an estate car rolling on its way to Durham as it takes people from Birmingham or Sussex to come and study here, that tells you why. We have a national system of mobility when you leave home to go to university. And that has deep roots in our history. It also tells us something about the power of the cultural model of Oxford and Cambridge. They had 600 years when they dominated the educational landscape and were able, therefore, to shape our picture of what a university was like. There was no other picture of a university until the 19th century, despite lots of attempts. So here, during the Civil War, was a Puritan divine asking why there weren't universities and colleges elsewhere. And he's got his list. Why isn't, he says, why wouldn't it would be advantageous to have universities or colleges, one at least, in every great town or city in the nation, as in London, York, Bristol, Exeter, Norwich and the like. I'm sorry you didn't mention Durham by name, But I've learned that Durham was one of the many places that was trying to set up a university, and it was indeed suppressed by Oxford and Cambridge, that was not willing to tolerate the creation of other universities. So even in the 17th century, there was a recognition that already the English model was very odd, with only 2 universities. These universities they suppressed the creation of other universities by having, for example, university rules that if you had been taught at Oxford or Cambridge, you were not allowed to teach anywhere else in the country. That was one way they stopped competition. They also had a very powerful monopoly position, which is if you wanted a senior place in the Church of England, you needed to be a graduate of Oxford or Cambridge. And this meant that essentially you didn't go for Oxford or Cambridge in order to study, you went to Oxford or Cambridge in order to get a route to well-rewarded employment. In the 18th century, by the 18th century, Scotland had got 4 universities. Adam Smith at Glasgow spent a year in Oxford, an unhappy year at Balliol, and afterwards tried to understand, it has a chapter of Wealth of Nations, trying to understand why the teaching at Oxford was so bad and so much worse than the teaching of Glasgow. And his argument was that people go to Oxford and Cambridge not for the teaching. They go to Oxford and Cambridge because it is the only way that the privileges of graduates in arts, in law, physics and divinity can be obtained is by residing a certain number of years in certain universities. In other words, they went there because that was the way to get a well-remunerated bishopric. So they didn't go there to study, and the teachers didn't need to teach. And if I may say so, you could argue that there is a modern version of that problem. If your CV is only going to be considered by Goldman Sachs or McKinsey, if you have been to a certain subset of universities, and it was the purpose of going to university is to signal to those employers your abilities, then that changes the incentives to focus on teaching as against research in the institution. So you have a duopoly in England, and because of the power of this duopoly, it is linked with a set of incentives in which teaching counts for very little. Now, after that, we have in the early 19th century, finally, the creation of new higher education institutions. Here in Durham, in the 1830s, a fascinating point in history, which, as I said, I now understand better. Down in London, we had the creation of UCL, followed shortly afterwards by King's College, where I'm a visiting professor. So we have 3 higher education institutions created in the 1830s. Oxford and Cambridge remain unreformed. Oxford and Cambridge carry on with college statutes that say if you part of becoming a member of this college is that you undertake there will be no further changes in the statutes of this college. Oxford and Cambridge remain unreformed until finally the government intervenes. And it was in that very generous introduction, you heard that I'm a believer, which I am, in the autonomy of universities. But I'm also a realist. And the reforms of Oxford and Cambridge that finally took place in the 1850s took place as a result of government activity. In fact, here is a list of the Acts of Parliament involving Oxford and Cambridge through the middle of the 19th century. Parliament was all over them. And some of the most historic professorships in Oxford and Cambridge, which we think of to this day, the Waynflete Professor of Philosophy, the Ditchley Professor of Political History. Though that's a classic example of how skilled England is in delivering radical reform. Those ancient professorial posts were constructed by government commissioners in the 1850s when they obliged Oxford colleges to pool their resources in order to create new professorships. They were the result of government commissioners sent in to reorganize the universities. So there was a lot of politics in universities, and universities remain politically significant to this day. So this very potted history, and I haven't got time to take you all through the subsequent history, but this has told, we've already learned something very important. We've seen the cultural power of Oxford and Cambridge. We've seen that the weak role of the local university, and also final and close government engagement with higher education policy. So that's a bit of history. I also try in my book to take a few steps back and do something which I think is more significant now than when it was when I embarked on the book 3 years ago, which is to make the case for the university. And there is a real problem of what I call the edu-skeptics. Why go to university? Why bother? And you read all the time in the media, there's stories of the unemployed graduate or whatever. And universities find it very hard to make the case for the university because within higher education itself, there are deep disagreements about how you should describe and think of the value of a university. So here, if you look, I've got kind of two divisions. You can focus on the benefits to the individual of going to university, that's the top half, or you can focus on wider benefits that don't accrue to the individual. You can also think about economic returns, that's the right-hand side, or you can think of non-economic returns, that's the left-hand side. An awful lot of people in universities spend a lot of time arguing with each other about which one of these quadrants is a legitimate argument to make. So you have people who love the idea that there are wider non-economic benefits, social benefits of university, and they would hate the suggestion that you focused on individual economic benefits. But look at the way in which advocates of the early years of education, the first 3 years, have won the case. I think, if anything, they've exaggerated the significance of the first 3 years by not getting bogged down in ideological arguments about whether you are an individualist or a collectivist and whether you're looking about economic returns or non-economic returns. They happily pool all those sorts of arguments in just an overall case for the first 3 years. And my view is that each one of those quadrants, you've got a strong empirical case. In fact, each one of those specific assertions that I put there, the statements filling up each one of those quadrants, rests itself on substantive, serious social science research that shows that going to university for 3 years changes you. In other words, most of this research tries to allow for selection effects. It's not just saying the kind of people who go to university have these features as well. These are attempts where you compare identical twins where one of them has gone to university and one hasn't. You look at people who are otherwise similar education achievements. Some of them go to university, some of them don't. There are other countries where sometimes under pressure, university places are awarded by lottery. So you've got people with identical characteristics, some of them go, some of them don't, because they've won in the lottery or not. So you try to do proper social science, and even after you've allowed for those type of effects, you find an added value for 3 years at university. And I'm surprised at the way in which it's become accepted that, oh, this is just a selection effect. 3 years away from home at the age of 18, which is the classic route, not the only route, the classic route, of course it would change people. 3 years conscripted into the British Army changes people. 3 years in prison changes people. 3 years at university changes people, and in turn it changes society. 1963 was the year when Robbins advocated university expansion and when conscription into the British Army came to an end. A shift from a society where there were more conscripted servicemen than university students to one where there are many more university students than people serving the armed forces, fundamentally in the long run changes the character of society in these type of ways. Now, when it comes to financing university, it's that top right-hand corner, the individual economic benefits, that are most significant. People who've been to university, by and large, earn more than non-graduates. I'm talking averages, there are individual exceptions, but overall, they earn more, which is why I think it is reasonable to expect graduates to pay back for the cost of their education, however controversial that might be. Here's the evidence. So the top lines are for all adults, age 16 to 64, the bottom half is for simply younger people in their 20s. But whichever way you look at it, Graduates, on average, earn more than non-graduates. Postgraduates, people who've got a postgraduate qualification, earn even more. So expecting the generality of taxpayers, many of whom will be non-graduates earning less, to fund the education of people who on average will be earning more is a highly regressive policy. And if you don't take that from me as a former Tory minister, Karl Marx thought exactly the same way. This is Karl Marx himself, and I think it's a very vivid way of putting it, and I would love to know why Jeremy Corbyn disagrees with Karl Marx on this very important point. This is Karl Marx's critique of the Gotha programme, proposed by the Social Democrats, who wanted tax-financed higher education. Why, he said, should you finance the education of the bourgeoisie out of general tax receipts? He saw this as a classic example of the bourgeoisie capturing the state in order to pursue the interests of the more affluent. He thought that it was, so that's why he thought it was a regressive policy. And within the British debate on higher education, similarly, a belief over time that it was reasonable to expect graduates to repay. There's a discussion of fees and loans in the Robbins report. It's sometimes presented as some kind of recent ideological venture by a group of us who moved in and took over a previously placid debate. Not at all. Robbins has a serious discussion of the issue, and very shortly after producing his report, he said, let's try to, this was, as he went on, he looked forward to the day when there would come a change in attitudes such that the equitable arguments for a considerable replacement of grants by loans would become practically relevant. So this idea has been around for a long time. I'm not going to devote all of my talk to funding, any more than my book is all devoted to funding, but as it is the current controversy of the day, let me just spend a few more minutes on the issues. So my case for the current system, and incidentally, of course, let's be absolutely clear, it's not a system in which the student pays. The student is provided with the funding. There's no check that has to be written by a student. The money never goes through the student's bank account. The taxpayer provides the money to pay for the student's education, and the graduate then pays back through PAYE at a rate of 9% on earnings above a high threshold. It was 15,000 when the original Blair regime came in. I raised it to 21,000. It's actually now just been raised to 25,000. So you pay 9% of earnings above that amount. So if you're not earning that much, you're not paying back. It's not like a mortgage or a credit card debt or an overdraft. So first of all, it's progressive. It means that you pay back if you're in a well-paid job, and if you don't, if you're not. It means that we have society invests properly in human capital, so there's no constraint. It's not like the American system. Nobody can say, I would love to go to university, but I can't afford to because I can't raise the funds. Nobody is paying up front, so we are properly investing in human capital. Because, thirdly, in the old days, when higher education was financed out of public spending, higher education always lost the argument of political priorities to other claims on public resources. So primary schools did better, secondary schools did better, the NHS did better. So higher education as a claim of public spending always loses out to other more high-profile causes. So this enabled more resource to go into higher education once it was outside public spending. And finally, when it is financed out of public spending, governments who have to control public spending on higher education by controlling the number of students. And although I sadly don't know the figure, until 3 years ago, this university, like every other university in England, would have been issued with a figure for the number of students it could take, and would be told, you are allowed to recruit 3,200 students, and if you recruit 3,201 students, you will be fined. So control over public expenditure required control over numbers, which meant that there were volunteers who wished to participate in higher education, who were knocking on the door of universities, asking to get in, who universities would have liked to recruit, but could not be recruited because public expenditure control meant that there were no places for them. Instead, when you move to a system outside public spending, at that point, individual universities decide who to recruit. You no longer have the state rationing places at university. So I regard the new system as in many ways superior to the old one. Now, of course, it's politically controversial, and there are lots of challenges to it. Some people say, but there should be price competition, so that a student should say, Durham, £9,000, don't like that, a bit higher, let's go to York, £8,000, or Leeds, £7,000. The system doesn't work like that. And it doesn't work like that because if you understood that it was a graduate repayment scheme, a student who said, I can't afford Durham at 9, I'm going to go to Leeds for 7, wouldn't have got their heads around the basics of the system. So once you've got funded by generous repayment model, there's no reason why a student should be price sensitive. But it doesn't mean there isn't competition. It means that the competition is between universities trying to attract students. And since the new system came in, some universities have expanded, others have shrunk, driven by their decisions about what they wanted to do and student choices. So you have competition for the first time, competition for students. And also, although a lot of people tell me that they are confident that good universities should be able to charge more than bad universities, this is quite a difficult model to operate in practice. Now, here is a ranking of universities by what I think the average middle-class parent has at the back of his or her mind of what constitutes a good university. And I have to say to this audience, Durham would be quite high up on the list. So I'm arguing this is a kind of implicit ranking of universities, and you keep on going, and you end up, sadly, with East London, Wolverhampton, Bradford. Guess the criterion I am using for this ranking. The criterion, and there's a clue, picture of two Brideshead Revisited type Oxford students. This is how I've done it. The ranking is by the proportion of students from the less affluent social classes. So you've got, at the far left, you've got Oxford and Cambridge with only 10% of students from the less affluent social classes 4 to 7. Durham, quite close, 14% of students from the less affluent social classes. And as you work through the system, they become less and less middle class. So this ranking, this implicit judgment that everyone has in their mind, matches almost perfectly the social composition of the student body. And that in turn relates to a picture of what universities were like in the days when it was Oxford and Cambridge and a university education for gentlemen. So my view is that a lot of the perception of what constitutes a good university correlates incredibly closely with the class composition of university. Now, if you look into the metrics that lie behind these rankings and things like graduate earnings and people who say good universities should charge more, some universities, undoubtedly the graduates earn more than from other universities. When we try to understand why the graduates are earning more, that appears to be determined largely by the social background of their parents, their prior attainment, very important in shaping the character of a university, but it hardly constitutes kind of added value by the university that should be rewarded by extra resources. And also geographical location. Being in the southeast is an advantage. There's some stickiness. Some students tend to stay in the area where they were studied. So if you're in the southeast where earnings are higher, that boosts your graduate earnings figures. And then, of course, a really good metric, research excellence, a metric which certainly propels Durham and universities like it high up research rankings, but which doesn't appear to correlate with teaching quality. So good universities should charge more. When you look at it close up, it seems quite problematic. You don't appear to have any reliable metric of teaching quality, which means it's a reward for that. Insofar as it correlates with higher graduate earnings, we seem to have other explanations as to why the graduates are earning more. So I'm not at all confident that we have a base for saying, yes, there should be competition where the good universities charge more. And of course, if you did it on the basis of the rankings, as I showed earlier, of social composition, what you would effectively be doing is having a kind of reverse pupil premium. You'd be saying the universities that take the more disadvantaged kids, the kids from the ethnic minority, should have less resource, and the universities that take the more advantaged kids should have the higher resource. And why should we have in higher education exactly the opposite of the principle we apply in primary education and secondary education? I find it hard to understand. There is some correlation of graduate earnings with courses of study. And so you could say students who do, and interestingly, STEM is in the middle. The graduates that earn most have done, by and large, have done those disciplines, law, economics, management. But I sometimes have conversations with people that begin by saying universities where the graduates earn more should definitely be able to charge more. And by the end of the conversation, the same person is telling me it's so important we have more engineers, that engineers should be exempt from any fees whatsoever. And they rarely want to see STEM students paying more than non-STEM students. So although a lot of people say they want to have differential fees, it's quite hard to pin down exactly the criterion on which people would agree. There are lots of ideas around for changing the system, and a lot of them I think are quite bad ideas. I've explained why I don't think differential fees works. If we just said, well, let's take £2,000 off the fees, that would be £2,000 off the resource for educating each student. I'm not sure that's a good idea. You could have a graduate tax, but then the government is once more allocating the money, so it's public spending. Do you really think that universities are going to do well in the battle for public spending when they've always historically done badly? So I'm not at all sure that there is a good way, so I think there's a series of really bad ideas there. However, it is not perfect. There are things we could do to change and improve the system. I think every 5 years there should be a review of the framework of graduate repayment to see if it's politically and socially acceptable. I do regret the fact that the last element of maintenance grant has gone. In my conversations with the NUS when I was the minister, when you got them in private and were talking about what their NUS representatives were most worried about, it was the cash in the hands of students while they were at university. They were worried about the pressures on students for meeting their cost of living. And I had a lot of sympathy with that. If I was trying to put more money in, public money or whatever, it would be to help students with their costs while they're at university. Part-time students, although my reforms actually led to an increase in the number of 18-year-olds going to university, there's a real problem with part-timers. I'd have a package for part-time students. As I said, rather than try to cut funding for the universities taking the more disadvantaged students, I'd want to provide some kind of equivalent of the pupil premium in higher education. I do think high-cost courses are entitled to more subsidy. And the interest rate on the student debt has really created a high amount of political concern, which I want to do something about. So I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm saying the basic principle of graduate repayment is right, but then try to improve on it and adjust it. So, I've talked a bit about the history. I've talked a bit about the funding. I now want to talk very briefly about the research side of the university, and then end by looking at 3 crucial trends shaping the university in the future. And here, as a tribute to the distinguished Germanist who introduced me, I have to say that the research-intensive university is a German idea. And from a German perspective, Oxford and Cambridge and English universities in the 19th century, Matthew Arnold summarized it very well. They regard Oxford and Cambridge as a very good gymnasium, a very good school. The research function of the university is an idea that originates in Germany, and the classic text by Humboldt, produced in Prussia after catastrophic defeat at the hands of Napoleon, Prussia trying to reconstruct itself as a nation state after the Napoleonic Wars, and he writes essentially one of the great education policy documents saying we should use our universities to drive not just teaching, but as sources of research. So the research-intensive university is a German concept, and although England had the first industrial revolution, largely based on craftsmanship, technical understanding, plus the sharing of information through learned societies and local clubs and groups, we fell behind in the second industrial revolution because we did not have systematic university-based R&D. And of course, it was the First World War, probably the First War fought at least as much in technology as in any other dimension. They say the First World War was fought in chemistry and the Second World War was fought in physics. The First World War brought home to Britain the fact that we were lagging behind in technologies, and this is from a government report of 1915 saying of Germany, science there has been more thoroughly and effectively applied to the solution of scientific problems bearing on trade and industry. And a sudden, desperate attempt to catch up in Britain by allocating a research function to the universities. And there was a fascinating debate, in particular, because of the attempt to get America into the First World War. America was neutral, as you will remember, in the 14, 15, 16. And the Brits thought we had a special relationship with America. The Americans were bound to join the war in our favor. And when Brits went to America, they found there was one powerful countervailing factor, which was leading American educationalists had all studied in Germany. Half the faculty at Harvard had got German doctorates. The way you advanced your academic and educational career in America was to go to Germany. And it was very simple. The doctorate did not exist in England. There were no doctorates because there was no research. The doctorate was created in England, first in Oxford in 1917, in response to Foreign Office pressure that Britain needed to have an alternative to the German offer to attract Americans to England rather than they're all going to Germany. And the Foreign Office summoned representatives from English universities to a meeting at the Foreign Office with the Education Secretary in a distinctly subordinate role about the importance of promoting migration into England to study as a rival to Germany's excessive influence on America. And the Committee of Vice-Chancellors and Principals, what's now Universities UK, was created as the corporate body of British universities to try to help deliver this. And the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Birmingham, seizing his opportunity at one of the crucial meetings, observed that it would be great, of course, to deliver the Foreign Office's agenda of starting to attract students from America. But it would be so embarrassing when they came to Britain and saw how ill-resourced our universities were. Was there any chance, perhaps, of getting some government funding so that the university experience that the American students had when they arrived would suitably elevate Britain in their eyes? And that was the origins, the first large-scale grants. The University Grants Committee was created in 1919. A lot, in other words, of the key institutions that we've been familiar with in the English higher education landscape emerged at the time of the First World War. And after that, we rather, I'm not going to go through this in detail, we rather overcompensated. We've actually ended up with a model where we've got more of our publicly funded R&D on universities, on university campuses, than most other countries. This is gross expenditure on R&D, public and private, in different countries, and you can see that the UK has got 26% of its R&D spent on university campuses, quite a high figure. What essentially we've done, because our overall R&D spend is not very high, we've gone for a strategy of having all our eggs in the HE basket. So if you look at this, you can see on the top line, R&D expenditure as a percent of GDP, we're rather behind other advanced Western countries. That's partly because we're behind on business spend on R&D. It's partly because we're behind on government spend on R&D, but the conspicuous exception is higher education R&D. We've essentially gone for putting all our eggs in one basket. We've gone for world-class levels of funding of university-based R&D, but without R&D in applied institutes outside universities. So Britain, in the 19th century, Germany was the centre for research-intensive universities, and Britain didn't have them. In the 20th century, Britain has caught up and made a massive bet on university-based R&D, whilst Germany actually moved, if anything, away from the university as the location of R&D and created networks of non-university institutes, Max Planck institutes, Fraunhofer institutes, and Fraunhofer's in particular been very focused on applied research for business, and similarly the network of American R&D institutes. One of the reasons why we have this agonized debate about how we're not so good at applying our research is so much of our research is university focused. We don't have that network of co-funded, public-private funded, non-university R&D institutes, which most of our major industrial competitors have. Let me conclude with a focus on 3 future challenges. And the first 2 are the absolutely classic forces driving change in the modern world. And both globalisation and the digital technology revolution are affecting universities just as much as they're affecting every other player in the modern economy. And then finally, there's one, the kind of subject that is a distinctive English issue. So I'm a believer in globalization. Of course, universities in some ways were one of the original global institutions. The medieval university, that first dozen universities I described at the beginning of this talk, attracted students from across Europe. Indeed, though there's a lively debate amongst the historians on this, the first use of the word nation, distinguishing people by which nation they belong to, occurred in medieval universities, which divided up their student body into the different nationes, the different natal groups which they came from. So the Germans, the Lombardians, the English would turn up and be a distinctive group in Bologna or the Sorbonne. So the university was originally a very international institution, and remains so to this day. I think that our ability to attract overseas students is a great advantage. I did have occasional disagreements with the then Home Secretary on this point, but I think it's fantastic that students from overseas want to come and study in England. And although there was endless turf warfare within Whitehall and between ministers on this, there's now the Migration Advisory Committee are at last doing a proper economic study of the economic impact of overseas students. I think it will show that they bring fantastic resource into Britain and enhance the education experience of British students. And that I think is a crucial case for expanding the number of students coming from abroad. But although we attract 500,000 students from abroad, we only send about 30,000 British students abroad. And that is too low. Occasionally, the British press describes every example of a young British person going to study abroad as a sort of catastrophic loss, as if it's kind of the brain drain. The truth is, more British students should have the experience of studying abroad. And I personally think that our system of fee loans should be extended so that those fee loans are available to students to take for overseas study. And if in this post-Brexit nirvana of all these fantastic trade deals that we're going to be negotiating, if that happens, you can be absolutely sure that education will be one of the items on the agenda in the trade negotiations, and the overseas governments will be saying, you attract a lot of our students, why you've got this hidden non-tariff barrier to trade by not allowing your loans to be used for students to studying abroad. You must end such protectionist practices, Britain, if you really want to have free movement of students. So I think there will be powerful pressure for fee loans to be taken abroad. Of course, it's very important that academic staff come from around the world. If you want to measure quite a good correlate, quite a good indicator of the quality of the academic research is to measure the distance that the academics of the university have travelled from their place of birth. And there are, I have to say, especially in southern Europe, universities where the staff are mainly from a 25-mile radius of that university. Those are not open, global, international, research successful institutions. So staff flows matters. And I very much hope that as part of the Brexit negotiations, we will continue to participate in European research programs, Horizon 2020, which is Framework Programme 8. There's a framework programme for every European budget cycle. I hope will be succeeded by Framework Programme 9, in which Britain participates. And there's a paradoxical effect of Brexit, which is where before we just took it for granted of easy flows of students and staff around Europe. I think universities will now have to make much greater efforts to achieve that, and I think we will start seeing British universities setting up campuses within the EU. Campuses. So I suspect the focus will shift perhaps away from Malaysia or China or India, and instead will be Germany, France, Italy, in order to maintain close contacts there. So Brexit is a challenge to globalisation, but I believe that universities can rise to that challenge. Then there's technology. Now, this is a picture of a lecture at the University of Bologna. To be honest, if you look at that, it's not totally different from what's happening now, 700 years later. It's also, incidentally, another example of the internationalization, because we know that the lecturer his name was Henry of Germany. So these were international institutions. You've got people in the back row having a chat amongst themselves, not paying much attention. You've got the attentive people at the front. You've got someone who's fallen asleep one row in from the back. This is a recognizable educational experience which I suspect is repeated in university lecture theatres to this day. Is education technology going to change that? And I am one of those who believes that the digital revolution is going to have effects on higher education and change higher education. So the next 50 years, I believe, will see more technological change than the previous 700. And it's going to come in many forms. And let's just focus on three. First of all, one of the classic features of the digital revolution is the middleman gets driven out, what they call disintermediation. So your local retailer loses out to Amazon. So the first question is, will the university be disintermediated in the digital world? And there's one obvious way where that could happen. If you do an online course, and there's some kind of check that we know you've genuinely completed that course, and there are ways that can be done, iris recognition software and the little camera on your laptop, the way that keystrokes differ from individual to individual. So if one person has been doing keystrokes in a certain way during the course, and the keystrokes are done in a different way in the final summary assessment, they know that there's something afoot. So the digital technologies are sophisticated. So if you do an online educational course and complete it, and on one of these fairly now achievable metrics show the person who did the course was the person who also completed it, and you post that completion on your LinkedIn profile, or you send it in to Microsoft when you ask for a job as a programmer with Microsoft, and they just know that you've completed the following IT courses to the following standard, where is the name university in that process? And part of what has made the university what it is the power to award degrees and the significance of the degree as a credential like no other that confirms your mastery of a subject. So the disintermediation threat to university is if the degree is disintermediated by direct evidence of completion of specific online courses. So that's one way that the digital revolution could challenge the university. So far, the hot topic for the last few years has been the MOOC, the Massive Open Online Course. And universities, I don't know, Durham probably did, put some lectures, filmed some lectures, put them up online on platforms like Coursera. And certainly there were American investors who thought that there would be a monopoly education platform, a monopoly platform for education materials like eBay or Amazon or whatever. There is no such monopoly platform. So far, the education world has not changed in the same way as many other sectors have done. And there's complicated reasons for that. Part of what seems to have happened is that getting material onto Coursera or any of the other platforms of itself doesn't deliver a very rich education experience. And we may well see a shrinkage of the presence on Coursera because these lectures get out of date, they're not properly maintained, the production qualities are not good. It actually costs quite a bit to maintain a high quality online course. That's before you get into being able to email an academic or sophisticated forms of academic engagement. And a lot of universities didn't have the capacity or the will properly to invest in the online material. That's why, and I declare an interest, I'm an advisor to an American ed tech company on this, to you. I think probably the future is more likely to be the SPOC, the small private online course, where proper money is invested in a serious online course available for people who subscribe to a university, but they're doing the university course online rather than physically coming to the campus. And at the end of it, they get a degree which is in all respects identical to the degree secured by people physically on the campus. Probably not many undergraduates will do that because going away from home is such an important social and cultural experience. But you could well imagine master's students, postgraduates, people who've maybe got a partner, maybe got kids, maybe got a job, mature students, part-time students, for whom the online learning becomes a viable option, far more viable than physically coming to a university. So I think the SPOC is important. And then thirdly on my list, and probably the most exciting, is simply the data analytics. So pedagogy becoming more enriched with empirical evidence than ever before. Because if you think about it, if you've got an online textbook, you can record every single keystroke, every single interaction with the education materials. And you could observe that 17% of students make the following mistake on question number 7 with the multiple choice options. You can observe that those 2 paragraphs seem to require longer eye contact with the page, because you're probably also using the camera, than the previous pages. You can observe that they all go for option A rather than option B. So you start understanding how the student is engaging with the educational material by, instead of having the kind of crude assessment that is possible at the moment, literally millions, if not billions, of data points. So you can redesign your education materials, you can personalize them. And there is no back row. Your knowledge of the educational experience of the person, metaphorically at the back, is as good as for the person at the front. So I think an empirically informed pedagogy and empirically designed educational materials become much more possible because we have so much more information about the educational process than ever before. So as you can see, I'm a technophile. I think this is good for education. I think it's very exciting, but it is a challenge to existing institutions. So I've talked about globalisation, I've talked about technology, the classic 2 forces in the 21st century. I'm going to end on something I really care about, which is a very unusual English problem. I try to explain in the book why it's an unusual English problem, which again goes back to the structure of our universities. But it's specialisation. It's specialisation linked with a very narrow picture of what a university does. And there are very few advanced Western countries that expect people at the age of 16 to take a decision about the subjects they will study that could literally determine the pattern of their adult lives. And of course, classically, life is a bit more complicated now, thank heavens, but classically, there are still lots of students, especially students trying to get into prestigious universities like this one, who at the age of 16 decide whether they should do science A-levels or arts A-levels. And then as a subset of that, there are lots of girls interested in science, who when they're interested in science, above all decide they want to be doctors, and go for the A-levels that will get them onto a medical course, and give up on the A-levels that aren't required for a medical course, and physics isn't required for a medical course. So England is in the position that only 25% of the girls who get an A star in GCSE physics stay on and do A-level physics. And although there are lots of ingenious attempts to raise the status of the sciences with girls, admirable causes, get them not to think that they're going to be doctors, which requires doing chemistry and biology and maths and dropping the physics, which is what they tend to do. Especially cruel trick, actually, because medicine is one of the few courses where there still is numbers rationing. So the biggest single group of people with good grades at A-level who don't then get a university place are girls applying to do medicine. That's a different story. The real problem is that no other country expects a 16-year-old to take that sort of decision. They keep on doing a broader range of subjects. Those CP Snow two cultures, there isn't some fundamental divide between the arts, humanities, and the sciences. And your Institute of Advanced Study here is an example of the incredibly exciting interconnections between those disciplines. It's a consequence of a set of decisions imposed on 16-year-olds in the English educational system, which they do not need to take elsewhere. And that, I have to say, is because universities expect to recruit people with a prior commitment to a particular discipline. And because our system is designed the way it is, where university students have to apply for university probably in a different part of the country. In other words, there isn't that entitlement to go to university if you've got above a certain level in a school leaving exam, which all those regionalist education systems deliver. Because you're having to apply, what the university is looking for really matters. And you apply to do a subject, and the academics in that subject want you to display a prior knowledge and aptitude in that discipline. What is the biggest single course that American prospective students state in their application form they wish to study at an American university? The biggest single option is undeclared. They have not yet taken a view. Undeclared. Now that creates a completely different environment within the university. So it means that in the first year, they're trying a bit of astronomy, and they're trying a bit of history, and the university has to try to recruit. The university disciplines are trying to recruit the students for their discipline by the way in which they teach it to the first years. And even then there'll be a major and a minor. It is a completely different model of the inner working of the university than one which says if you want to study physics, you've got to do A-level physics. Probably to get to Durham, you've got to have a good grade in your A-level physics. In other words, we want you to know a lot of physics before we will then educate committed physicists. It is a completely different view of the role of education, and is possible because of a balance of power that partly arises from every young person having to apply to university and nobody having a right to go as you would have to your state university in the US or to your Land University in Germany. So we do have a highly specialized education system in England, and it's heavily driven by the way in which university admissions are conducted, and I think it's bad for the cultural and intellectual life of our country. It also ties in with a picture of the university as a place where what you do is academic subjects, when of course there are also many vocational subjects that students can do. And I'm going to end rather self-indulgently with a set of images from, you might think this is a church. You might think that looks like, if close up, those would be images of saints in some chapel. This is actually the Great Hall of the University of Birmingham. And this is the stained glass window whose design was supervised by Joe Chamberlain, who was one of my heroes. I come from Birmingham, and being even more personal about it, my family were all Birmingham craftsmen and artisans, and my great-grandfather was one of the glaziers who put those stained glass windows into the University of Birmingham. And close up, you actually get a picture of a set of values, not unlike perhaps your own Institute of Advanced Studies here, because what it celebrates is a range of different disciplines. There's the arts, of course, literature on the left, languages on the right. There's a range of, in the maths, there's geometry. I can't see the other one on the left. And then here is science. That, believe it or not, on the right-hand side is silver plating. No, sorry, electroplating. You've got, that is bridge building, science. The last one was, I think, if I remember correctly, mining. See, we've gone back to the beginning. We have to stop there. So it was a celebration of the wide range of ways in which a university can educate people, breaking down the barriers between the different disciplines, and that's one of the things that can and should make the university such a transformational experience. Thank you very much indeed.